Treasurer, good morning. Welcome.
Nice to be with you, Barrie.
Why didn't Parliament sit just a little longer to deal with this medical evacuation bill?
Well, Parliament rose in accordance with its normal schedule. What took the time of the Senate was the amendments that both the government and the crossbenchers moved. Labor guillotined debate, and when the Labor Party puts up bad policy which will unravel our offshore protection procedures as we know it, we'll fight them every step of the way. We won't greenlight it. And I have to say that when you look at what Labor said would happen over the last week, they didn't meet any of their objectives. They briefed out that Dutton was going to be referred to the High Court. They said we wouldn't have the support of the crossbenchers when it came to energy. They said we were going to be forced to accept their amendments to the encryption bill, that we would suffer this defeat on border protection, that would be cornered on religious freedoms. None of that occurred, and in fact it was Labor who, even in the words of The Guardian, unconditionally surrendered on national security.
But you talk about you weren't going to greenlight this legislation. We know very well you were going to try and red light it, but you didn't have the numbers. Is that why you avoided the vote?
Well, we had to move amendments because we're not going to allow a bad piece of policy to go through unamended. So we moved that, but it was the Labor Party, Barrie, who actually guillotined debate in the Senate.
But you could have waited. I mean, it's not unusual for the House to wait an hour or two and wait on the Senate.
Well, I mean, let's put it in perspective. Forget about the procedure. Let's talk about the substance. When we came to government, there were 2,000 children in detention. We've removed those children from detention, closed down 17 detention centres, stopped people dying at sea and stopped the boats coming. What we're now seeing from Bill Shorten is Kevin Rudd all over again. Kevin Rudd told the Australian people he'd be an imitation of John Howe when it came to border protection. Well, 50,000 unauthorised arrivals came on his watch. We have three pillars to our border protection policy. We have the turn back the boats, which Labor says they'll do, but so did Kevin Rudd. You've also got offshore protection, which now they're promising to unravel. And you've got the temporary protection visas, which they've already said they'll unravel.
Let's talk about the middle one. You say that it will unravel offshore processing as we know it. If you change the administrative arrangements over how you deal with sick kids on Nauru, how is that throwing the whole policy overboard?
Well, see, this is the distraction. It's actually not about the kids on Nauru. There are 10 kids on Nauru and 4 are soon to go off to the United States. This is about around 1,000 males who are largely Iranian on Nauru.
All right.
And
well, again, what's wrong with treating them more compassionately when they fall ill?
Okay, so in the legislation that's been put forward by the Greens and the Labor Party, the minister's decision can be overturned by an independent panel. So no longer is the minister now the final decision maker. Secondly, when it comes...
Well, just on that point, what's wrong with an independent panel overruling an individual?
Well, the minister has a broad discretion here, but what we're seeing is the minister not being able to stop someone coming to Australia on broad character grounds where you can do on a whole series of visas. The security grounds in this legislation are confined to the definition in the ASIO Act and not the broader definition of character grounds. You don't even have to be ill to be coming to Australia. What you needed to do is to come here for assessment. So there are some details in this legislation which I don't think the public are aware of, which would see our border protection policy unravel.
They're details, though, and government ministers are saying that this is an end to offshore processing as we know it. Why would you throw your hands in the air and say, well, this would end offshore processing when it's just an administrative arrangement about how you deal with ill people? That's the message that your government is sending to the people smugglers, that this is the end of offshore processing.
Well, as you know, this is a most difficult issue. And people would have the best of intentions but end up delivering the worst of results. We have to have a strong deterrent in place. That's the history of this issue, Barrie. And we were cleaning up Labor's mess.
But hang on, you're saying there's a deterrent factor in this, so yeah. You punish genuine refugees to deter others?
Well, actually, a lot of the people, that 1,000 cohort who are mainly male, are not refugees, and they're the ones who this legislation is targeted at, not the children. I mean, we've got 2,000 children out of detention. What I'm saying is, when it comes to the history of this policy, we have to remain strong. we have to be resilient. We can't respond to whatever motions are being put up at the latest Labor National Conference. If you do, you will see a repeat of the failure we saw after the last 6 years.
You will have to face it in February. You're just putting off the inevitable. As I mentioned earlier, you could lose a vote on the floor of the Parliament on legislation for the first time in 90 years, very close to an election.
Well, Barrie, I've heard predictions about what would happen in the Senate and the House many times over the course of this year. They said we wouldn't get through our legislative
I think you believe this
cuts.
prediction. That's why you avoided the vote.
Well, no. What was taking up the time of the Senate, as I said, was the amendments that were being moved by both the crossbench and by the government, because we're not greenlighting a bad policy. But it's not about the procedure here, it's actually about the substance of the issue, and Labor's now putting up the white flag to the people smugglers, and in the process, they are going to weaken our borders.
Are you so anxious to avoid this vote in February that you might in fact go to an early election in March?
Well, the Prime Minister's laid out very clearly that our intention is to deliver a budget and a budget surplus, the first in more than a decade, on April the 2nd, and then there would be an election in the normal course after that.
So that's a guarantee?
Well, ultimately the decision about the timing of the federal election is the Prime Minister's, but that is what his stated public intention has been today.
He said that, so it'd take a lot, wouldn't it, for him to go back on his word?
Well, I think it's important that we have the opportunity to deliver a budget, because the Australian economy is strong. We've recently seen the national account numbers come in where Australia is growing at 2.8% faster than any G7 country except the United States, bearing in mind that when Labor was last in office, they thought the economy was strong at 2.1% GDP growth, and unemployment under Labor, which is at 5.7%, it's now fallen to 5%, and we're delivering on our economic plan of cutting taxes and more than 1 million new jobs.
You say you're anxious to bring down a budget. You've got MYEFO, though, coming up tomorrow week. Will that be simply a picture of where the economy is right now, or will that also contain some measures, some initiatives?
Oh, well, there's always measures within MYEFO, but it's also a good indication of where those headline numbers are. And as I said, we will be delivering a surplus in 2019-2020, but we've also already made a number of announcements about important funding decisions: more money for school funding, more money for drought assistance. We got the historic change to the GST distribution, which Labor said pigs would fly before that was done. Well, we did it, and got a better deal for every state and territory as a result. All those numbers will play out in the MYEFO numbers.
And they're all known, but is there anything down the track, perhaps more tax cuts or something that you might... Would you take that opportunity with MYEFO to make some announcements around that?
Barrie, I know you'd like me to reveal to you what's going to be in MYEFO and next year's budget.
Just the strategy. Would you make announcements about...
Look,
there might be something new in there.
Well, the government makes decisions about spending and revenue over the course of business, but we obviously have announced a number of things already, including substantial benefits for small business, including cutting red tape, getting big businesses to pay small businesses on time, putting in place a $2 billion fund to increase their access to finance. A number of those things have already been announced.
The last growth figures showed a bit of a slowing in the economy. The next growth figures are out on March the 6th. Is there in prospect that might show a further slowing? In other words, the further we go towards April, the less rosy the picture will be.
Actually, the economic fundamentals of the Australian economy are very good, and no lesser authority than the Reserve Bank Governor has said that. He said the outlook for the labour market is positive, and we've seen wages growth at 2.3% in recent weeks, which was the biggest jump in 3 years. We've seen business and investment confidence growing and being strong, and we've seen unemployment levels fall to the lowest level in 6 years. So the fundamentals are good, and as I said, we're growing faster than any G7 country except the United States. So I'm confident that we're on the right...
Is that right?
Yes, it is.
In that comparison, when I saw another figure the other day that we're 106 in the world.
No, we're at 2.8%. No other G7 country except the United States, which is growing at 3%, is higher.
Well, it depends how you calculate it, because the last one was 0.3.
Well, if you're talking about the last quarter, we did see growth in both household consumption, We saw growth in exports, we saw growth in housing construction, and we also saw strong investment both in Commonwealth and state levels in infrastructure. So when you look at the overall economy, the numbers are good, and as I say, 2.8% compares to Labor's last year in office at 2.1%. And what will be a real wet blanket over the Australian economy is the $200 billion of taxes that Bill Shorten is promising. And we've seen in recent days real confusion about one of their signature policies, which is to abolish negative gearing, as we know it, which couldn't come at a worse time for the housing market.
All right, thanks for coming in, and have a good break when you finally get one.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you.